During the early 20th century, women made up a quarter of the workforce. This number increased when women were forced to take men's places in factories during World War II. The working women quickly realized they were being snubbed of pay and were receiving significantly less than their male colleagues. This caused the women to speak up and created a major debate across many people, households, groups, and views. The Equal Pay Act was introduced in 1945 as the first piece of legislation in American history aimed at gender discrimination in the workplace. Its purpose was to provide equal pay for equal work and create a voice for women. The first women's movement largely took place in the 1840s to 1917. However, many still ponder or skip over what happened before the movement. The very famous Abigail Adams quote, "I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors," was first written in a letter from her to her husband John Adams while he was establishing laws for the new country. Many say this now very popular quote lit a spark in women, which started the very early first women's movement. The first feminists questioned the status of women at that time and pushed for women's rights. Once the movement formed, they decided to focus mainly on women's suffrage. The 19th Amendment, which granted women's suffrage, was first proposed to Congress in 1878 and was voted on in 1887 but was defeated in the Senate. The 1900s saw change in that many states began to support women's suffrage, however the act continued to not be voted on. In 1919, there was already a woman in the House of Representatives, and some states had already granted their women residents the right to vote. In the summer of 1919, the big vote for the 19th Amendment took place and was luckily approved by Congress and was put into effect in 1920. Feminism was non-existent in the 1930s and 1940s. Due to the Great Depression and many wars going on around the world, many women became distracted while running their household and taking care of their children. During World War II, many women stepped up to replace men in factory jobs while they were off at war. This was a new experience for many of the women because traditionally the only jobs women held were as teachers, nurses, or secretaries. When the men returned home, they expected the women to go back to their normal jobs and for most of them to go back to being housewives. The women became frustrated because they thought they were doing great working outside of their homes and they wanted their jobs back. This feeling inspired Betty Friedan's book titled The Feminine Mystique, which gathered a lot of attention and is now given a lot of credit for bringing back feminism in the 1960s. The publication resulted in women getting new job opportunities, including working in factories, journalism, libraries, and other places. Over time, women realized they were getting paid outstandingly less than their male colleagues, and especially their husbands. These working-class women were making just 60% of how much the man right next to them was earning. Even though the National War Labor Board had decided less than 10 years before that while the men were off at war that the women should be paid as much as the men, it no longer mattered to the major companies. The women began looking for change and reintroduced the Equal Pay Act. It had first been introduced in 1945 as the first bill aiming to solve this problem for women, and it quickly gained attention. Numerous women began marching, going on strike, and protesting in favor of the labor law. It was amazingly signed by President John F. Kennedy in 1963 and became the newest amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act. When the law went into effect, it included many great solutions and statements, including that the pay gap tends to cause labor disputes, thereby burdening, affecting, and obstructing commerce. It gave women the right to sue against pay discrimination, and recommended factors that the company should put into account when considering pay that are fair, which were skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions, and seniority. However, many corporations found loopholes in the Equal Pay Act, and some people began to wonder if the act did anything at all. By the time the law passed, it was so watered down that it almost had no effect. In 1979, the Southeast Missourian newspaper published an article explaining that the gap was still there, and as wide as ever. They went even further to say that women still weren't given the best jobs because the employers were against the EPA. New opinions formed about the pay gap over time, which resulted in a major debate over if, how, and why the women were getting paid less. Many people believed that it was just plain sexism and discrimination since the men were still getting paid much more with hardly any explanation from employers. One feminist was quoted saying, "There is no sex difference in the food she buys or the rent she pays. There should be none in her pay envelope." Since the Equal Pay Act claimed to guarantee equal pay for equal work, they were disappointed to see no change while they were still making 60 to 70 cents to the male dollar. The argument from the more feminist point of view was that the unequal pay deprives women of a payment that is rightfully theirs and creates unnecessary resentments in the workplace. They also claimed that it penalized the lowest paid workers in the community and was uneconomic since it put an incentive on the inefficient use of workers. Another true claim was that no employers ever paid women on the plus side of the pay scale. Others argued that discrimination was not the reason for the gap. They believed that the reason women were getting paid less was the female workers' need for flexibility. Many of the working women were mothers, and they demanded shorter shifts and less time on call. They desired more predictability in their hours than the male workers, and since the men working didn't care as much about their hours, they were often offered the higher paying jobs. Some people pointed out that there were 3 groups on the pay scale, which were men, women with children, and women without children. Both of the sides got support and backlash over many years, but neither found a solution for the gap that began to seem never-ending. 16 years after the Equal Pay Act passed, a woman named Lily Ledbetter took a job with Goodyear Tire and Rubber in 1979, where she ended up climbing the ranks to become an area manager. 2 years before she was planning to retire, she was given an anonymous note that told her the 3 other male managers' salaries and brought to her attention how much less she was making than them. She was told when she was first hired to never discuss her pay, but she still knew that she needed to do something, and she filed her charge in 1998. Her verdict didn't come out until May of 2007, and even though she was given no money, she put in 18 more months of work to create the Ledbetter Bill to protect future generations from pay discrimination. In one interview, she was asked about the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and said clearly no one enforced it. Just a few years after she won her case, President Barack Obama signed the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act as his first bill signed into law on January 29, 2009.
Because women still earn just 77 cents for every dollar men make. Those pennies add up to real money. It's real money for the little things like being able to take your kids to the movies, and for the big things like sending them to college. It's paying your rent this month and the mortgage in the future. It's having savings for the bill you didn't expect and savings for the dignified retirement you have earned.
Now we are able to see the many failures and successes of the Equal Pay Act. The best results were that women can now sue against pay discrimination and that women began speaking up against the problem. Some of the failures are that the gap still exists today, with women making an average of 81 cents to a man's dollar, and that some states still don't have equal pay laws at all. Today we can see that women of color have become very affected by the gap. In comparison to a white man's dollar, a black woman makes 63 cents, a Native American woman makes 57 cents, and a Latina woman makes 54 cents. This is despite the fact that women earn college degrees at a higher rate than men. One economist once said, "There are a lot of reasons why this gap remains, and there is certainly room for some of that to be discrimination."